Across the United States, there are certain cities where poverty runs so deep it feels completely baked into the landscape itself. You can spot it instantly in the abandoned storefronts, the empty lots, and the neighborhoods where homes look like they've been frozen in a state of financial struggle since the mid-90s. You feel it in the underfunded schools, the local wages, and the way entire communities seem to be holding their breath, waiting for a comeback that just hasn't arrived. Now, let's be completely clear right up front. This is absolutely not about shaming anyone who is struggling financially. In fact, folks living below the poverty line are often the ones working the absolute hardest just to keep their heads above water. What we are talking about today is the failure of the cities themselves. We're looking at systemic issues, the massive job losses, the failed policies, the ineffective local leadership, and decades of total neglect. And sure, we have to acknowledge that every city on this list still has a few wealthy pockets. Even the most economically depressed towns in America usually have a neighborhood or two with trendy coffee shops and yoga studios. But those few bright spots don't erase the harsh reality of the broader community. So today, we are diving into the data to look at the 10 poorest major cities in the U.S. using the most recent numbers straight from the U.S. Census Bureau. Before we jump into the list, if you enjoy this kind of content and want to support the channel, please take a quick second to hit that like button and maybe share this video with a friend. All right, let's get into it. Number 1 is St. Louis, Missouri. Honestly, St. Louis is the kind of place that really should be thriving a lot more than it currently is. It has a rich history, die-hard sports fans, a vibrant culture, and some absolutely incredible barbecue. Plus, it's home to the Gateway Arch, which is easily one of the most famous monuments in the entire country. If an iconic steel arch could magically fix the economy, the city would be in incredible shape. Unfortunately, famous landmarks can't pay the light bill or put food on the table. Trust me, if they did, I'd probably pack my bags and move there tomorrow. Right now, roughly 30% of the residents in St. Louis are living in poverty. A number that high points to some very deep structural issues. We aren't just talking about a couple of struggling blocks tucked away from the main tourist spots. This level of hardship is completely woven into the everyday fabric of the town. Yes, there are absolutely neighborhoods that are safe, beautiful, and well-maintained, places the local government has clearly invested in, but then there are other areas that look as if city officials simply drove through, locked their doors, looked the other way, and never came back. The roots of these problems stretch back for decades. St. Louis took a massive hit from population decline, a huge wave of residents fleeing to the suburbs, and a severe lack of business investment. And when higher-income families pack up and leave, they take their tax dollars, the political focus, and the city's economic momentum right out the door with them. What's left behind are communities trying to survive with a fraction of the budget and a rapidly growing list of challenges. The most frustrating part of all this is that St. Louis legitimately has everything it needs to be a powerhouse. It has a prime geographic location, a strong legacy, massive institutions, big corporate employers, and a major cultural footprint. But it is also deeply divided by inequality and a terrible habit of abandoning certain neighborhoods. City leadership loves to talk endlessly about the brighter future they're going to build someday, and that sounds wonderful. But promising a better tomorrow doesn't help when rent is due on the first of the month. As of 2025, an alarming 29.2% of the St. Louis population sits squarely below the poverty line. Number 2, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. When most people think of Milwaukee, they picture a tough, hard-working Midwestern town famous for cold beer, baseball, and locals who will fire up a backyard grill in weather severe enough to make a penguin rethink its life choices. But that's really only half the story. The other half is heavily defined by crime and poverty, and unfortunately, there is a lot of both. Milwaukee is teetering right on the edge of that 30% mark, meaning nearly 1 out of every 3 residents is living below the poverty line. That is not just a minor economic slump. That indicates deep-rooted systemic issues that aren't going to be fixed just by opening another craft brewery downtown and calling it urban revitalization. For decades, Milwaukee has battled intense segregation, the collapse of its manufacturing industry, and a heartbreaking divide between neighborhoods.
You have areas that are doing perfectly fine, sitting in stark contrast to communities trapped in a relentless cycle of generational poverty. That divide is easily the biggest hurdle the city faces. You can have pockets of wealth and prosperity, but if massive sections of your city are completely starved of opportunity, public transit, financial investment, and reliable jobs, the overall health of the city is still critically poor. Honestly, that contrast is Milwaukee's biggest curse. The city has so much potential. It has incredible talent, a great location, and a fiercely proud cultural identity. But it is also weighed down by a long history of economic inequality. And let's be real, that inequality doesn't just vanish because a developer flipped an abandoned warehouse into overpriced loft apartments for a couple named Trevor and Madison. What is especially striking about this is the context of the state itself. For the most part, Wisconsin as a whole has relatively low crime. Milwaukee is the major outlier, holding the vast majority of the state's crime rate. Right now, Milwaukee is still desperately trying to figure out how to make economic progress actually reach everyone, rather than just benefiting a few lucky blocks down by the water. Personally, I genuinely like Milwaukee. I think it's a really cool city with a lot of heart. But the reality is tough. Exactly 29.9% of Milwaukee's population currently lives below the poverty line.
Number 3. Toledo, Ohio. Let's talk about number 3 on our list, Toledo, Ohio. Honestly, Toledo is one of those towns that tends to slip people's minds entirely, unless you're reading an article exactly like this one, or you happen to be watching old reruns of MASH. If you know, you know. The character Klinger was famously from Toledo and a massive fan of the Mud Hens. And as a quick side note, yes, the Toledo Mud Hens are absolutely still around, playing AAA minor league baseball today. But these days, when folks hear tough stories coming out of Toledo, the usual reaction is a collective, yeah, that tracks. Pointing out that Toledo is struggling isn't meant to be a cheat shot at the city. It's just the cold, hard reality of being a Midwestern industrial hub that took a massive hit when the old manufacturing economy packed its bags and left town. This was a city literally built on factory floors. For generations, those manufacturing jobs were the backbone of the local economy, supporting families, keeping neighborhoods thriving, and putting food on the table. But when those industries dried up, a massive chunk of the city's stability vanished right along with them. There was an era when Toledo was a fantastic place to make a living as a blue-collar worker. Was it a perfect utopia? Of course not. But an average resident could comfortably buy a home and take their family out to a nice dinner without stressing over the bill. That stability started slipping away in the early 1970s, and unfortunately, the decline just never stopped. Right now, the poverty rate in Toledo is sitting at a painful 30.1%. No matter how you try to spin that, it's a brutal statistic. It means nearly a third of the entire city is living below the poverty line. Toledo is wrestling with the exact same demons as so many other Rust Belt towns on this list. Vanishing jobs, aging and crumbling housing, completely underfunded neighborhoods, stagnant wages, and a population that keeps moving away to find better opportunities. You've got schools trying to perform miracles on a shoestring budget, and old commercial streets that look like they're waiting for a Hollywood comeback story that just never got greenlit. The people who live in Toledo are genuinely doing their best to turn the ship around, but the city still feels trapped in the shadow of its glory days. It is incredibly difficult to build a brand new future when your original economic foundation was ripped right out from under you and nothing solid was ever put in its place to rebuild on. Toledo isn't a hopeless cause, but it is definitely one of those spots where the word affordable is often just code for a local economy that has completely lost its drive. What this town desperately needs is a massive manufacturer or a major corporate employer to move in and hire a huge chunk of the workforce. That is the exact lifeline Toledo needs, but so far, they just haven't been able to reel one in. As it stands, 30.1% of their population is living below the poverty line.
Number 4 brings us to Newark, New Jersey. Newark is honestly one of the most baffling entries on this list because it sits geographically right next door to unimaginable wealth, yet it still struggles immensely. And that proximity is exactly what makes the situation sting so much. Newark is practically a stone's throw from Manhattan. On paper, it is surrounded by massive opportunities, major corporate jobs, extensive transit systems, bustling ports, and international airports and top-tier universities. But what looks good on paper doesn't always translate to the streets. The reality is that everyday people are battling severe poverty, sky-high housing costs, and living in neighborhoods that have been completely shut out of the surrounding region's economic boom. Newark's poverty rate is alarming on its own, but when you combine it with the notoriously high cost of living in North Jersey, the picture gets incredibly bleak. Struggling to make ends meet is tough anywhere, but being broke in a massive metropolitan area where everything is wildly overpriced feels like getting knocked down and then being handed a bill for the experience. Now, to be completely fair, Newark has undeniably made some real strides. You'll see new redevelopment projects, fresh investments, and a public image that is much stronger than it was a couple of decades ago. But let's be real, not all comebacks are created equal. A lot of the time, urban revitalization just means building shiny new high-rises for people who already have plenty of options. Meanwhile, the longtime locals are stuck dealing with the exact same problems in the exact same neighborhoods, tripping over the exact same broken sidewalks and dodging the same massive potholes. That uneven distribution of wealth is exactly why Newark lands on this list. The city doesn't lack assets or resources. The problem is that access to those resources is wildly unequal. You have certain districts sprinting into the future, while other communities are left standing on the platform, watching the train pull away without them. When that happens, economic progress is really just a shiny PR statement, not an actual reality for the people who need it most. Right now, a staggering 30.4% of Newark's population is living below the poverty line.
Number 5. Buffalo, New York. Let's move on to number 5, Buffalo, New York. For about the last 15 years or so, Buffalo has been officially declared in comeback mode. And to be perfectly fair, they have made some genuine progress. You'll see solid investment down by the waterfront, a lot of fresh energy in the downtown area, and a much better branding campaign that has successfully brought in outside attention. All of that is genuinely good stuff. But here is the reality check. The poverty rate in Buffalo is still sitting at over 30%. That means a massive chunk of this so-called comeback has been more of a brochure than an actual breakthrough. It sounds fantastic on a press release or the local evening news when city officials unveil a brand new, perfectly paved sidewalk. But if you walk just half a mile away from that shiny new project, you are still looking at neighborhoods that have been completely neglected. Historically, Buffalo was a massive industrial powerhouse, but then the manufacturing jobs dried up, the population plummeted, and the city has spent decades trying to shake off a relentless series of economic gut punches. While a few select neighborhoods managed to stabilize and score those shiny new development projects, others were totally forgotten and left behind. What makes the poverty in Buffalo feel a little extra cruel, though, is the weather. Look, struggling financially is already exhausting enough on its own, but trying to survive on a tight budget while massive amounts of lake-effect snow are actively trying to bury your car, your house, your sidewalks, and your general will to live, that just feels downright rude. Winter in Buffalo doesn't build character, it bills you for it. If you didn't know, depending on the year you check the stats, Buffalo is consistently ranked as one of the absolute snowiest cities in the United States. That lake effect coming off Lake Erie just tears them up every single winter, and dealing with that level of brutal freezing weather is incredibly hard when you're completely broke. But similar to other towns on this list, the core issue in Buffalo is that the economic progress simply isn't spread evenly. Certain districts get all the investment dollars, the trendy new restaurants, the glowing headlines, and the "look at us now" treatment. Meanwhile, huge sections of the city are still trapped in concentrated poverty, dealing with aging, crumbling housing, and severely limited opportunities. Ultimately, Buffalo isn't quite as bad as some outsiders like to assume, but it's also not the miraculous rebound story that local officials want it to be.
For way too many residents, it still feels like a city that took a devastating hit decades ago and just never stopped limping. Over the last 10 years, the city has sadly become a bit of a punchline because of its high poverty levels and questionable local management. You really hope they can turn the ship around, but the current reality is incredibly tough. Right now, a painful 30.9% of Buffalo's population is living below the poverty line.
Number 6. Fresno, California. When most folks hear the word California, their minds immediately go to oceanfront mansions, Hollywood celebrities, perfect 70-degree weather, and people casually dropping $14 on a slice of toast because the avocado was supposedly blessed by monks. But that is absolutely not the California you will find in Fresno. Fresno is the part of the state that completely shatters that glamorous illusion. It is not shiny, it is not trendy, and it is certainly not trying to sell you a luxury lifestyle brand. Instead, it's a massive inland city filled with incredibly hardworking people who just can't seem to get ahead no matter what they do. Fresno holds one of the highest poverty rates of any major city in the country, and landing on this list is especially brutal when you're located in California. The state's notoriously high cost of living can take what looks like a decent paycheck and instantly turn it into a stressful month-to-month survival puzzle. By the time you factor in the high cost of housing, skyrocketing utility bills, groceries, and gas, it all adds up incredibly fast. Historically, Fresno has suffered from much lower wages and far fewer high-paying career opportunities than the famous coastal hubs. And to be brutally honest, this whole inland stretch of California has some really tough spots. Bakersfield has had its struggles, though it is trying to improve. Stockton has major, well-documented issues, and Modesto struggles right alongside them. But Fresno is one of those specific places where a person can be working a full-time job and still find themselves completely broke, which sadly feels like one of the most aggressively American things you can experience in 2026. The region's economy was built entirely around agriculture, but as the years have passed and technology is advanced, farms simply need fewer and fewer actual humans to get the job done. City leaders have tried bringing in other industries, like logistics and warehousing, but it hasn't been the magic fix they hoped for. Let's face it, a local economy can only support so many fast food assistant managers before it hits a wall. Because Fresno is constantly overshadowed by massive cultural giants like Los Angeles, San Diego, and the Bay Area, it rarely gets talked about on a national level. When it does actually get brought up, people are usually just complaining about the brutal summer heat, the terrible air quality, or trying to figure out how rent is still so painfully high in a city that so many people are trying to move away from. Fresno is exactly what happens when you combine premium California prices with stagnant inland wages and just cross your fingers. Spoiler alert, that math rarely works out in the residents' favor. Right now, a staggering 31.5% of Fresno's population is living below the poverty line.
Number 7. Miami, Florida. Miami is easily the flashiest city we're looking at today, which is exactly what makes its high poverty rate feel so completely absurd. When you picture Miami, you think of luxury high-rises, exotic sports cars, rooftop pools, and social media influencers acting like their entire life isn't just one missed paycheck away from total disaster. Oh, and enough cosmetic surgery to rebuild half the nation. On the surface, Miami looks incredibly wealthy, but a massive chunk of the people actually living there are not experiencing that glamorous version of the city. You definitely aren't seeing the real Miami when you're scrolling through heavily filtered TikToks and Instagram reels. The actual day-to-day reality is a completely different story once you strip away all that online nonsense. A huge portion of Miami's local economy is built around tourism, hospitality, and service industry jobs. The harsh truth is that those fields simply do not pay enough to live comfortably in this city. That is the ultimate trap. Miami constantly sells this high-end, luxury lifestyle, while a massive percentage of its actual workforce is just trying to survive in one of the most painfully expensive housing markets in the entire region.
What you end up with is extreme visible wealth stacked directly on top of quiet, invisible struggles. Miami is a city defined by those brutal contrasts. You have multi-million-dollar yachts right next to severe budget stress, high-end designer boutiques down the street from absolute paycheck panic. You have breathtaking penthouse views, while just below, regular working folks are cramming into shared apartments because it's the only possible way they can afford to live close to their jobs. A city can have billions of dollars tied up in luxury real estate and still be a place where everyday people are getting financially squeezed from absolutely every direction. Look, there is no denying that Miami is a stunningly beautiful place. But while beauty might be free to look at, it is incredibly expensive to live next to. For way too many locals, this city feels less like a tropical paradise and a lot more like a highly attractive financial ambush. As it stands right now, 31.7% of Miami's population is living below the poverty line.
Number 8. Baltimore, Maryland. Well, look at that. We are actually talking about Baltimore and focusing on poverty instead of just the crime rate for once. Though, to be fair, crime is definitely an ongoing struggle there, too. Baltimore is one of those frustrating cities where the massive potential is glaringly obvious the second you arrive. It has a fantastic geographical location, gorgeous historic neighborhoods, a beautiful waterfront, major institutions, port access, a fiercely strong local identity, incredible food, and character for days. You can look around and see every single puzzle piece needed to build a world-class city sitting right there on the table. Yet, a massive chunk of the population is trapped in poverty, and it's an absolute tragedy. Now, just as a quick fact check, while some older estimates or specific neighborhood stats might throw around numbers as high as 34%, the most recent U.S. Census data actually puts Baltimore's overall poverty rate right around 20%. But let's be completely real, having 1 in 5 of your residents living below the poverty line is still a full-blown crisis. For generations, Baltimore has been wrestling with deep-rooted poverty, a severe lack of corporate investment, and massive neighborhood inequality. You have some districts that are incredibly stable and thriving, then just a few blocks away, you'll find areas that look like they've been sealed in a time capsule of total neglect and frustration. The city has been trying to repair itself for a very long time, but the progress always feels incredibly patchy and inconsistent. It's a bit like putting a fresh coat of paint in the living room while the rest of the house is actively on fire. High crime rates haven't helped, political corruption hasn't helped, and the completely broken trust between the residents and local leadership definitely hasn't helped either. Because poverty is so heavily concentrated in specific neighborhoods, it makes it incredibly difficult for families to break out of the cycle. When your local public schools are underfunded, good jobs are scarce, and basic safety is shaky on a good day, you aren't exactly playing with a full deck of cards. What makes Baltimore's situation so sad is that it genuinely feels fixable. It always has. It's an incredible city with so much built-in potential, but there are just way too many neighborhoods where it feels like politicians have looked at the map, shrugged, and decided those blocks simply aren't worth the effort to save. Honestly, sometimes it feels like local leaders are just waiting for everyone to pack up and leave so they can bulldoze the area and build a giant Amazon warehouse. Like I said, the problems are fixable, but it is certainly not an easy fix. The city just has far too many incredible strengths to be struggling this badly. But when a community spends decades fighting the exact same battles and seeing the exact same limited results, people eventually stop expecting real systemic change and just start settling for things being slightly less bad. Right now, it doesn't look like there is a cohesive strategy to turn things around. It just looks like total urban exhaustion. Number 9. Detroit, Michigan. As I've mentioned in some recent videos, and as you probably already know, Detroit is legitimately turning a corner. The downtown area is doing incredibly well right now. Honestly, they have made more solid progress recently than they've seen in decades, and you just have to hope that fresh energy starts spreading out into the surrounding neighborhoods sooner rather than later. But historically speaking, Detroit is probably one of the most famous urban cautionary tales in modern American history.
We all know the basic outline of the story. At one point, it was one of the wealthiest, most powerful, and most influential cities in the entire country. It was the absolute beating heart of the auto industry, packed with jobs, a booming population, undeniable energy, and pure swagger. But then the manufacturing jobs started leaving. The massive factories shut their doors, the population took a nosedive, and the local tax base completely collapsed. It got to the point where entire sections of the city literally looked like the apocalypse had a permanent mailing address. Like I said, downtown is looking much better today. There is real investment happening and genuine momentum building in certain districts. The city has absolutely clawed back a well-deserved measure of civic pride. But when you look at the poverty rate, it tells you that this comeback story is still very incomplete. Now, you might occasionally hear some older estimates or articles throwing around numbers over 36%, but the most recent U.S. Census data actually puts Detroit's current poverty rate right around 34%. Still, regardless of the exact decimal point, having over a third of your city living below the poverty line is a brutal reality. For a massive chunk of Detroit's residents, all that hyped-up urban revival just hasn't shown up at their front door yet. If you live near the shiny new developments, things probably feel a bit more optimistic. But if you don't, everyday life can still be an absolute grind. Poverty here touches every single aspect of living: public schools, housing quality, transportation, healthcare, neighborhood safety, and access to reliable jobs. And that is the most difficult part about Detroit's situation. The economic fall was so incredibly dramatic that even real, tangible progress can look tiny compared to the sheer amount of damage done over the decades. You simply don't recover from that kind of total structural collapse overnight, and you definitely don't fix it just by opening a few trendy restaurants, building a massive sports district, and getting some optimistic write-ups in national magazines. Detroit still has heart. Honestly, maybe more heart than any other city in America. But pure heart and hustle can only carry a community so far when over a third of the population is trapped in poverty. Detroit is absolutely not dead. It is just still paying heavy interest on old disasters. So the reality today is that roughly 34% of their population currently lives below the poverty line.
Number 10, Memphis, Tennessee. And finally, taking our last spot, we have Memphis, Tennessee. It's wild to think about, but Memphis has really overtaken places like Detroit, Gary, Indiana, and Camden, New Jersey in the conversation about the hardest places to live in America. And honestly, it isn't just the financial struggle. The crime rates here are completely off the charts. But when we look strictly at the poverty numbers compared to the rest of the cities we've talked about, it's not even a close contest. We are talking about nearly half the city living below the poverty line. Roughly 4 out of every 10 residents are completely trapped in poverty. When the numbers get that high, we aren't just looking at a few rough neighborhoods or scattered hardship. We are looking at a full-blown, citywide emergency that has tragically just become the everyday normal. Memphis is a city that carries massive cultural weight. It has legendary music history, deep Southern roots, a massive logistics industry, a huge personality, and serious national name recognition. If pure soul and culture could build a thriving middle class, Memphis would be completely unstoppable. But unfortunately, real life just doesn't work that way. For years, this city has been battling stagnant low wages, struggling public schools, decaying neighborhoods, severe crime, and an economy where upward mobility is virtually non-existent for a massive chunk of the residents. And the worst part is, none of these problems exist in a vacuum. They all feed directly into one another. Poverty breeds community instability. That instability ruins schools and drives up crime rates. Failing schools lead to lower future earnings, and those low earnings just lock people right back into poverty. It just goes round and round, exactly like the world's worst carnival ride. Imagine being stuck on a merry-go-round, and every third time you spin past, someone reaches out and slaps you right in the face. That's what this cycle feels like. What makes the situation in Memphis uniquely brutal is just how persistent the problem is. This is not a brief economic dip. It's not the result of one single factory closing its doors or one mayor having a bad term.
This is deeply entrenched, long-term poverty that is painfully familiar to the locals. Entire communities have been hauling this heavy burden for decades. Meanwhile, local politicians just keep cycling through the same empty promises, catchy slogans, and polished speeches that somehow never manage to actually reach the neighborhoods that desperately need the help. Memphis absolutely has talent. It has deep culture, incredible grit, and a civic identity that most other cities would kill for. But when 42.3% of your entire population is living in poverty, all that rich history starts feeling less like a point of pride and more like a convenient distraction, something local leaders point to so they don't have to talk about the actual crisis happening on the streets. Memphis takes the top spot on this list because the poverty here isn't just high, it is completely overwhelming. Like I mentioned, an unbelievable 42.3% of the people here live below the poverty line. Alright guys, that wraps up today's video. I would absolutely love to hear your thoughts on this list, so please drop a comment down below and let me know what you think. I hope everyone has a fantastic rest of your day.